Hello everyone. I'm just back from 3 weeks in Jamaica, including watching the hurricane from the safety of a good building. Unfortunately not in the eye of the hurricane. But I want to start by reading from Isaiah. This is the passage, just a couple of verses. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and of the fear of the Lord. His delight is in the fear of the Lord. I'd never noticed that verse, his delight is in the fear of the Lord, before. And it fits in with something else that I hadn't thought about before. It's a throwaway line that popped up on YouTube from an Italian who's doing stand-up comedy in Britain. He's very clever, but he made a comment which is so politically incorrect. And yet I said, my goodness, there's something in that. The subtitle was White Men Don't Steal. Of course, that's not true, but it is at one level. And I started thinking back, and I think it's very much related to the promise about our Lord. His delight is in the fear of the Lord. And he shall not judge by the sight of his eyes, nor decide by the hearing of his ears, but with righteousness. It says that the Messiah will delight in the fear of the Lord. So that's obviously something we should do as well. Delight in it. Why? Well, that solved two problems for me in a way. Where did we learn that? Because the comedian is right at one level. When I went to school in what we called elementary school, the first 5 years, we didn't have any lockers. If we had a satchel, which some of them had, I didn't have anything to hang up except my jacket. But bags and coats were hung up on hooks with numbers, and we had our own numbers. Only one episode of theft came to public notice. There must have probably been others, but only one came to public notice and was unsolved. So the headmistress took this very seriously, and the whole school was interrupted and assembled in the assembly area, where we began every day with a reading from the Bible and prayers. And she explained that there had been a theft and that we were going to sit in this hall until the thief owned up, which in due course he did. He then received his punishment in public, 6 of the best, and it was all over. One episode of theft that came to that head in 6 years. Why? And I started thinking more. When I went on to high school, after a year or two, I had saved enough money by doing odd jobs to buy a really good bike, a Claude Butler, for those of you who are fanatics for these things. I never had a lock on it. I rode it to school, put it in the bicycle shed, and picked it up when I left. And it had no lock. So there was a culture that had been formed in some way which looked upon that kind of petty theft as beneath our dignity. I wouldn't do that. So we didn't lock our doors in our working class area. Now, that implies that there is something that matters to us at a deep level, so deep that it was what Newbigin introduced me to as tacit knowledge. The behaviors we have acquired and believe to be good and true, but we don't really track back to where they come from. Is that the reason that Isaiah writes that Jesus shall delight in the fear of the Lord? Why? Because that's the only adequate basis for the kind of culture that I grew up in. people didn't actually connect it. I didn't connect the dots for a long, long while. It was going to Africa that connected the dots. We are inhibited by the things we fear, aren't we? And what's being implied there is a society that doesn't have a legitimate fear is in trouble. And we can see that this makes perfect sense. The people who keep the law are those who recognize that there will be judgment. A society that has ceased to believe in judgment, ceased to believe that moral consequence will work out at some point, is going to do whatever it wants to do. Hence, we reach the point where when you talk to medical students about ethics, which is largely an academic exercise, the way it's taught at the moment, usually reducing to four things: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. No discussion of whether any of those four things is more foundational than others. And of course, not stealing comes in the last category. I will not do that. What you will not do is important. Honor is defined by what a man will not do, and a woman too, using the noun inclusively at that point. Interesting thought. And if that is enculturated into you as a child, it's an incredible gift. I could not fabricate or drop data that I didn't understand. It had to be dealt with. That's part of this process, and it's disappeared now. We don't even know how much of the scientific literature is fabricated today. And if you're a Darwinian, the only question is, can I get away with it? Not, is it right or wrong? Right or wrong? Well, that's just for unsophisticated people. And the sophisticates who rule us now are bereft of metaphysical knowledge. They've had a lobotomy. And that's why they're such a disaster. They're not worthy to rule. When I was younger, if malfeasance happened in a department of government, the minister resigned. When did you last hear of somebody resigning because something had been done wrong, and resigning before public retribution was appearing? It was, I'm in charge of this department. It happened. It's ultimately my fault. I resign. That used to happen. No more. This is the best example of how post-Christian we are. So the reason the working class people that I grew up with didn't steal to any significant extent, as I've said many times, we didn't lock our doors, neither did most other people. One woman with MS down the street, her husband put her in a chair in the kitchen in the morning, and she stayed there all day with the door open, and people came and went to see if she was okay. The postman, the baker, the milkman, and neighbours. When there was a bill to pay, the guys coming knew where the money was in the teapot. She was never robbed. That wouldn't happen today. Now you can turn on YouTube and see parents getting angry because their children are being sent to prison for theft. It's not worth it. It's only a few $100. That's not the point. So a society that has reached that point, I think, can only come back if there is something like a religious revival. That's happened in the past. I mean, the 18th century revival, which I go back to so often because it, to me, is such an important lesson, something for Christians to be praying about very seriously, transformed Britain and America. The spread, Whitefield and Wesley and Jonathan Edwards all knew one another, and they were the three men who changed the culture. I mean, out of the 18th century revival, there was real social change. Whereas governments that claim to be in favour of social change, as all Marxist governments do, end up with a gulag. And thousands of people being put in prison, not for stealing, but for having wrong thoughts. That's frightening. But the 18th century revival, quite different. It was the driving force for the almost evangelical zeal that Britain had for abolishing the slave trade at considerable cost. The British naval bill for ridding the seas of slave traders wasn't paid off until our century. You don't hear that discussed, and you certainly don't hear any discussion. How come that was not only acceptable? Ordinary people in large numbers wrote to Parliament when they put off pressuring the rest of Europe into agreeing to get rid of slavery. And they had to go back to negotiations, say, politically in Britain, we cannot not get on with getting rid of slavery now. That was centuries ago. So what happened to my working class neighbours was that they had gone to school where the Bible was read every day. Not a verse or two, and no multicultural nonsense. Cultures make different places. The Western world is the product of Judeo-Christian culture. Nothing else made a major contribution. Secularism is pretending you can get by without any metaphysics, but you only have to find an academic who thinks they've been passed over for promotion and they cry for justice. But they have no basis for justice. In a Darwinian world, there is no justice, only the strong dominating the weak. That's the world we live in now. China's problem is precisely that. The CCP is only concerned about power. It has no ethics except the party. Loyalty. Loyalty over truth. Ask that question all the while of your friends and colleagues. If there's a challenge to your little subgroup, which is going to win, loyalty or truth about it? Now, if you're a Muslim, there's no question. Islam teaches that it is the Muslims' duty to do whatever they can to advance the cause of Islam, and lying, if that advances it, is perfectly okay. You can lie to the infidels. They're ultimately of no value. Anything that brings them down is by definition good. So loyalty to a group is a good thing, but it must be under truth. So loyalty and truth are in deep conflict. Now, of course, you have sophisticates who say, well, truth, what's that? Your truth, my truth. Totally relativistic until it hits them in the guts, and then they complain, I want justice. So I didn't intend to start off with that rant, which has apparently lasted about 10 minutes. In part, you see, having just come back from Jamaica and renewing old friendships and thinking back to the 1970s when we were there for a length of time, Jamaicans do much better than American-born blacks when they get to America. They've had several ministerial positions held by people whose origins are in Jamaica. They're not all good. Kamala had some connections with Jamaica too. She's not in the same league, but many of them do. And one of the reasons is that Jamaica was a Christian country. Insofar as it had religion, it was Christian, and it still is. There's only very small groups of any others. There was a synagogue in Kingston. I think it still exists. I don't know of a mosque in Jamaica. Now, their religion, their Christian religion, there are Catholics. I haven't met many Catholics on my trips, but the majority are Pentecostal in outlook. And I have something to say about that. On this last trip, I did end up talking to pastors, preaching a couple of times, having discussions about these issues with various groups of people, and going to a day-long pro-life conference. So some discussion came up. It was very, very interesting. This is the first time I can remember in a Christian conference, at the end of it, one black pastor had just heard a talk that had a lot of infection from blaming colonialism for everything, and therefore blaming white people for everything, not realizing if you go back in history, there have been many more colonial peoples. The Muslims was the biggest and most brutal for a long while. That they, by far and away, the leaders of slavery in the world. You would never believe that to listen to our liberals, but that's the truth. Currently, there are more slaves in Africa than there are on any other continent, and so on. But this pastor got up and said, look, we're not going to make progress unless we realize that playing the victim card and blaming colonialism and racism for everything really doesn't reach the problem at all. You can't even blame racism without being racist yourself, because you're blaming somebody else on the basis of their race, while at the same time you want them not to blame you on any basis of race. That's incoherent. The sooner we get away from it, the better. Thoughtful black intellectuals say, look, colorblind is the only way to go. And then you can start talking about real good, real evil, if you've got the means to do that, which so many of the students don't have today. I have yet, in over 20 years of asking the question, I have yet to meet a group of medical students who have been taught the Georgetown mantra, which all of them are: autonomy, justice, beneficence, non-maleficence. Georgetown mantra because it came from Georgetown. I've yet to meet a group who's been asked the question about ordering. And I think a lot of our problems today are problems of order. Which is more important, truth or loyalty? We've just touched on that. Asking students about how to order those 4 things in the Georgetown mantra, they look at you as surprised. And if you ask them, well, which one do you think is most important? The commonest answer over the years would be autonomy. Actually, it's very simple to show that autonomy is the one that is dependent on all the others. So the bottom line, the foundation, we've already mentioned it indirectly, is what you will not do. Non-maleficence, not doing harm, not doing evil. Now, a lot of people, when you put it that way, say, oh yeah, that's Hippocrates. Well, in part, yes, but it's also the 10 Commandments. That's what they are, the 10 divine intolerances. And when they are built into a society, all sorts of things happen that couldn't happen otherwise. So once you've decided what you will not do, you have created something very, very important. And I want to read exactly what Polanyi says about this so that you can get it right. So this is my quotation book. I hope you're all got one, and you're giving one to your children and encouraging them to write down every good quotation they ever come across, because the only excuse you have for not saying something well when you've heard it said well is laziness. You haven't bothered to learn it. And what Polanyi pointed out was that the adherents of a great tradition are largely unaware of their own premises, which lie deeply embedded in the unconscious foundations of practice. That's what happens when you read the Bible to children every day when they're at peak memory. If the citizens are dedicated to certain transcendent obligations, and particularly to such ideals as truth, justice, and charity, and these are embedded in the tradition of the community to which allegiance is maintained, a great many issues between citizens and all to some extent, can be left and are necessarily left for individual consciences to decide. The moment, however, a community ceases to be dedicated through its members to transcendent ideals, it can continue to exist undisrupted only by submission to a single centre of unlimited secular power. He wrote that in 1966. How prescient he is, more than 50 years later. You cannot run a society well if you don't have metaphysical agreement. Now, quite clearly, there is agreement between Jews and Christians because you can get all those ideas from the Ten Commandments and their development in the Torah. But there is no question that the Islamic world puts loyalty to the Islamic world above truth. You can't have agreement anymore. When in Britain, following up on the rape scandals, the communities locked solid behind the rapists. They would not come forward and say, yes, we know who was doing this. But they did know. I mean, it's breaking down a little bit now, but that's not going to cut it in the long run. We have to grasp the nettle, which is multiculturalism. Cultures are different, and they're incommensurable in many ways. So we have to start asking ourselves and our children, and discussions on YouTube are beginning and have been for some time, but they need to become more common. Particularly the elite in our society have to bite the nettle. I remember the first time I brought this up in a medical setting, and it was in Portland. I was speaking at the medical school. I was never invited back after this particular talk on Grand Rounds, in which I asked the people at Grand Rounds, and it was a big crowd, do you think multiculturalism is an adequate base for the practice of medicine? Raise your hand if you do, and almost everyone did. And I said, well, I think I can show you that you're wrong. Nothing like rubbing their nose in it to make sure you don't get another invitation to speak there, which certainly happened to me. And I said, you all practice medicine, and you know how important cases are in your memory forever. They become part of who you are. Oh, yes, I've seen this before. I know what happens if you take that choice. This is the right one to take. Well, I said, I only have to tell you one case history, and you will be smart enough to take the point. I said, I saw in Africa a little girl who had a neglected septic knee. By the time she got to the hospital, she was septicemic, dying with pus in the tibia and the femur. Now, the only thing that could be done at that point was to cut off her leg, get the pus out, and fill her with what antibiotics the mission hospital had. The parents were told, they said, we need to think about it, and the process was started to get the OR ready and the like. By the time the OR was ready, the parents had left the hospital with the child. Now, I was horrified, but nobody else was. And I'd done rounds with the nurses in the pediatric department that morning. So I said, may I talk to you? Because there's something to sort out here. And I said, fortunately, correctly, I said, what would you have done what would the parents have done if this had been a little boy? And they said, oh, they would have done the amputation. I said, why would you treat little boys and little girls differently? And they said, well, in our culture, it's a woman's job to cook the food, bear the children, till the ground, fetch the water. If she's got one leg, she can't do that, so she'll have a life not worth living. Does that sound strangely modern? How many of you, I said to the audience in Portland, would still defend multiculturalism, and basically they sat on their hands. They weren't pleased, but they weren't prepared to defend their position. One young woman bravely raised her hand. And whenever I tell this story, which I do not infrequently, I think of her and hope and pray that she makes it with her honesty to a deeper understanding. And so I said, it's courageous of you to stand up. But if you are as honest as you appear to be, I think you need to resign from this medical school and try and find a multicultural one, because medicine in the Western world is not multicultural. It's primarily Christian, and that goes back a long way. So in eroding that Judeo-Christian base and dominantly Christian, you are making medicine much more difficult. And in fact, it cannot go on because it's a moral activity. Every time the question is, what ought I to do? And the oughts do not come from the physical facts. Now, she didn't leave. She had the courage to stay and listen to the rest of the talk. Now, as I've said, I never got another invitation to on Oregon's health, what's it called? Oregon State Medical School, anyway. I've never had another invitation. Interesting that it was Oregon, the first place to kill patients, which, of course, anybody who's deeply entrenched in Christian theology, that's not something you do. That's God's province, not ours. They were the first in America to kill patients, and they're still doing it. Nowadays, Canada has outstripped the world and leads the world in killing people in hospital and encourages them to be killed because of bureaucrats who look at figures without putting them into a human context, and have seen, or everybody's known for a long while, that we spend most of our healthcare dollars in the last few months of our lives. If we were more Christian, we wouldn't do that, because we would have more trust in what God is doing. And I'm glad to see at long last people are beginning to do work not only on whether you can do certain operations on elderly people, but whether it actually leads to any real benefit. I will not take any major operation now because I know that my physiological reserves are not what they used to be. And what studies are showing is that, yeah, you can go into hospital and they can manage their technical prowess, and you spend a long while in ICU and then in hospital and then in rehab if you make it at all. Not the way I want to go. The most important thing at the end of your life, as Robert Spitzer pointed out to me many years ago, the last 6 weeks of life are times of reconciliation. The most important thing to do once you realize that, okay, here's my exit ticket, I will not be upset by that, but it will make me sit down and say, is there anybody that I have wronged that I have not apologized to? It's a time of reconciliation. That's what should happen at the end of life. In Robert Spitzer's example, which he said, you just imagine Bill and Jim, who were good friends when they were teenagers, and they fell out, and they can't even remember what they fell out about now. And now, years and years later, Jim hears that Bill is dying, and he says, oh, I've got to go and see him. And he goes, and of course, they end up hugging one another in tears and say, what on earth happened? We were good friends, and we can't even remember what we fell out about now. That's the way to end life, leaving more peace behind. That comes from having a bigger picture, not a multicultural one. Now, when I went to African villages to try and take the work we'd done in Jamaica and put it into practice in the most deprived villages in the world, some of them. A couple of days' walk from the road, no services of any sort, no running water, a spring which had probably only been capped by missionaries in the last little while, And I explained why it wasn't done before, not because they couldn't do it, but because it didn't make any sense. And I thought, well, it's easy. I can, first of all, identify them. And they were amazed that my children and I could process 300 people, 300 children in a morning, three making the measurements, me supervising, and one putting them into a computer, and then sat down with the village health committee and just hit the numbers, and we could then say, well, these are the ones who are in trouble. And I said, can your machine do that? They'd never seen anything like it before, of course, but they all immediately agreed that those children were thinner than the others, that they were not doing well. And I said, well, here's what you do. Solution. That didn't work. That really blew me away, because I was enamored of the modern reductionistic science. You make measurements, and the measurements dictate what you do. Well, here was my comeuppance. I got back the next year, and it wasn't working. And then I learned why. One of the nurses whose child had died of malnutrition while I was away, he was identifying malnutrition and saying the right things in the clinic, but then his own child died. Why? Because he believed that an evil spirit had taken the child's appetite away, and so he'd spent his money on the witch doctor and the child had died. I use the term witch doctor. There are natural healers. They're a different breed. They would ultimately become sort of naturopaths, and they have some real skills, particularly with psychiatric disorders. But the witch doctor deals in evil spirits, and that's what was at stake here. Now, don't laugh at cultures that believe deeply in evil spirits. I mean, if you live in Central Africa, the area that we love has had civil war for the last 20 years, and rape is a rite of passage, as it is in South Africa in the ghettos too. Don't laugh at people who believe in evil spirits. It is one way of understanding your world, and you have witch doctors you can turn to, but it makes more sense of the world than a God of love, doesn't it? In many places in the pagan world, and I use that word descriptively, not pejoratively, in many places in the pagan world, infant mortality rates are still high. They're coming down, but they're still very high. Children die apparently at random. I mean, one hut in the village, a child same age survives an outbreak of a disease. Another one doesn't. Why? Well, evil spirits are local. They make a complete explanation, as they do for apparently random failure of crops and utterly arbitrary government and exploitation by officials. No, evil spirits, there's evil in the world. They don't have any doubt about that. And that it's local, not universal in their view. And of course, we in the West are downplaying anthropology. The most important starting point for Christian faith is, oh my goodness, I am a wreck. Self-examination, properly done, no one can handle it. That gives you some compassion for sin, but it also makes you aware that this is the biggest problem that humanity has to deal with, and everybody has to deal with it. So it makes sense. Once you've got that right, then the Christian story and the Jewish story and other stories have means to deal with that involve sacrifice, ultimately the sacrifice of the cross. We have no concept of quite how that works. What we do have, and we see it again and again and again, and it's happening around the world at the moment in unlikely places, the most striking one being Iran, where there are now over 1 million born-again Christians, because one of the dominant ways this is happening is people having dreams about Jesus visiting them and telling them who to speak to and what to read. And they are having little hidden churches, and they don't care if they get found out. They're even reaching out to others. And it's beyond the reach of the ayatollahs, who are totally corrupt, wealthy themselves, and their people in abject poverty in many places. They can't even keep the water system going. So there are 1 million new Christians, mainly young people, in Iran. Similar things are happening in Indonesia and around the world. Even in our own Western world, young men in particular appear in their late teens, early 20s to be searching, going back to church, looking for meaning there, and finding it. Not everywhere, however. So here I come to the next bit, and that's why Jesus delighted in the fear of the Lord. That fear of judgment, of moral reality, of a real structure to the world is so fundamental to having a stable society. When we agree on what we ought not to do, which, let's face it, the Ten Commandments are by far and away the best example of that. That's why so many liberals hate them. They try to take them out of courtrooms. Why wouldn't you have them there? Even churches don't always display them. This is crazy. But then, during my last 3 weeks in Jamaica, the churches I went to, as I said, the church is mainly Pentecostal, Brethren, Baptist. There are Catholics, but and there are some Anglicans, but I didn't on this trip interact with either of those two groups. But I did go to a Pentecostal church and to a Brethren church. And the Pentecostals really loved their music. And I would love to see in our churches more of the passion, sadly probably somewhat superficial, judging by various other little things like, although they don't have a great income, many of the women have some very expensive accoutrements, shall we say, and people looking at how families spend their wealth. Well, it's not like my parents, who lived frugally but never went into debt and didn't complain about their lot, managed to save enough to have a holiday every year, managed to look after my needs till I got to the level where everything was taken care of by scholarships. It amazes me that my parents could run their family on £6, roughly $20 a week, and never go into debt, never be hungry. My mother made all my clothes, that was one, and all her own. So that was a big takeaway for my father. Something quite extraordinary. Now, that's not happening around the world in families that call themselves Christian and don't have a budget, don't work out what they can afford, and then cross out the things that they can do without. I mean, we can do without fancy clothes and cosmetics and fancy shoes. We can be just functional, and you'll be happier. Nobody's happy with debt. It's a source of anxiety. So I looked around and realized that if the church is going to make a difference in how the world works, we have got to have something that approaches a biblical liturgy, and there has to be something that approaches a biblical lectionary. Let me explain what I mean. I'm currently worshipping in an Anglican church, and I love Cranmer's opening prayer for the communion service. Almighty God, unto whom all our hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of your Spirit. There's not a wasted word there. I would put it right at the opening of the service if I was a pastor, because I would want people, and I would say probably every week, because we forget so quickly, God knows everything about you. Nothing is hidden from him. Don't play games. He still loves you. But that love is a love that wishes to bring you to the point that Isaiah says the Messiah will have, where you love the fact that there is going to be judgment. You love the fact that there is real good there, which implies real evil and a problem to be dealt with. And you have the problem. We all have the problem. Our thoughts could not be put on display. We would have no friends. And that leads, of course, into repentance and the need to recognize that even that is a gift. We can say we're sorry. That's not repentance. Real repentance changes your character. It becomes things that you will not do and things that you will do by the grace of God. You can't do it on your own. I mean, the parable of the vine needs rereading regularly. And this is where much more reading of Scripture. The older churches with a liturgy also have a psalm, a New Testament, a gospel, Old Testament readings going on throughout the year. Unfortunately, it's crowded out very quickly by what's going on. When you see somebody in church looking surreptitiously at their phone, you're supposed to be worshipping God. Do you really interrupt God for a wretched phone call, which in the past could always wait, so can still wait? I grew up in a house that never had a phone. We had to walk down the street with our pennies to put in the phone box and call a number. And if you got what you wanted, you press button A. Otherwise, you press button B and got your coins back and tried again a little later. But that's what we had to do. When I was riding my bike all over the continent before I went to university, there was no contact except my everyday postcard would be coming in. The postcards arrived from Britain in 1 day and from Europe in 2 days. Now, we're not going to have a postal service by the looks of it in Canada very shortly, because it's been taken over by screens and high tech. But that is desperately problematic. And this is the other thing that I'm going to stop with this one after that, because I want you to really go away and think about this. The first lecture I gave when I got to Jamaica this time was to medical students. And I asked the students, how many of you are struggling with anxiety in your first year? It was a first year medical school class. How many of you are struggling with anxiety? And almost every hand went up. They hadn't made the connection to struggling with anxiety and phones. I think the wonderful work that Jonathan Haidt has done, and if you don't know it, get the book, The Anxious Generation, read it, think about it, pray about it, and change the way you run your family. Screens are destroying us. They shorten our attention span, and I've been proving that to myself, so that I'm going to limit my screen usage even more, because one of the good things that 4 or 5 days of being shut down by the hurricane, I read 1,000 pages, over half of Tom Holland's Dominion, which I urge you all to read, and other books, Gunton on the Holy Spirit, and a wonderful Elizabeth Gooch novel, because there was no screens to speak of. It was down a lot of the time, and I didn't have a computer with me. I could use my host's computer when I wished, but I did use it too much. And that immediately shows up in how many pages you read. I used to read in my teenage years novels almost at a sitting, and many of my friends did too. I remember one guy, Mike Lowry in Jamaica, who just gobbled up a novel or a thriller in no time. He'd learnt that skill, that he could read that way. That's dying. So wisdom, which is what Isaiah 11 is about, has gone. The word doesn't appear in the modern university, which is a reason for closing down the arts faculty. If the arts faculty can't teach students what wisdom is and help them to become wise, it ought to be closed down until it can do that. That's what it used to be about. Eliot saw it coming way back in the 1930s. Where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we've lost in information? Well, current students have no category for wisdom and not much for knowledge, because knowledge is permanently processed and understood information. But their education, particularly medical school, the first 2 years, run by egos of unthinking doctors who want their bit of medicine taught in the introductory year in exquisite detail, which none of the students can handle. What they're expected to do is just nonsense. It's information overload, and the only way to deal with it is cynically, and they do, both by short-term memorization and every maneuver they can find to beat the system. And some of the students say, well, if we're smart enough to hack, that's your problem, not ours. We do everything we can to pass. And we found out what you wanted us to know, so we've demonstrated we can do that. They can solve limited questions by going on Google. But it doesn't mean that they are processing that information into the kind of knowledge they will need for medicine. I mean, what you have specialists for in hospital is people who don't have to pull it up on Google because they know from what they've experienced and what they've truly learned. And so they have real knowledge at that point. So I say information is a medical student. Knowledge may be a resident, if you're lucky. But wisdom, knowing when not to do things and when to do them, you'll be very lucky if you find that in medicine in the near future. There are still some out there who do that, because medicine does teach you. If you like people and you listen to their stories, it will change you. It's not an accident that medicine makes more Christians than the law does. There are many more lawyers in Canada than there are doctors, but the Christian medical organizations are an order of magnitude bigger than the Christian legal foundations. The one leads to cynicism and has gone the same way. One of my grandsons is doing very well in the law. He's passed and he's articling well. But we've had a long discussion about the nature of law. Just as in medicine we have no philosophy of medicine, the law has no philosophy of law. When I pointed him to Left's account of why this is a very bad idea, he shrugged and he said, Grandad, modern law is purely procedural. And we had one of our Supreme Court judges say, nobody is concerned with decisions made before 1960. This is incredibly disheartening. Common law is the greatest gift of the English monarchy. Alfred and his sons set it up. It's got a long history and it's brilliant, but now is not the time to deal with that, because I see I'm already approaching an hour, which is far too long for a podcast, but some of you stayed a distance, and thank you for doing so. But go away and think about these things, and think about what you can do in your home and in your church to limit the damage done by screens, by having more conversation about what matters. Getting back to the Jewish insight that you must eat together. Families that eat together stay together. The older version was families that pray together stay together. Both are interactive. But we are in trouble. in the Western world because we have lost our foundations. Fortunately, there are people out there who are pointing this out, and they have a growing following. I'm astonished that anybody listens to this podcast, but I now know that they do, and I can only ask your forgiveness for the fact that I don't have all the bells and whistles around, because I'm not interested in that. I talk about what is currently on my mind, heart, and soul, and I'm grateful to those of you who tell me, please continue. You are feeding my heart, my mind, and my soul. That's all I could ask for. So God bless you all.